Hello and welcome to Climate Watch. I'm Fei Fei. This week, world leaders gathered at the UN for summits as part of the high-level week of the 80th session of the UN General Assembly. At the climate summit, Chinese President Xi Jinping announced a new set of climate targets paired with a call for greater responsibility and stronger international cooperation to curb carbon emissions. In his video speech, President Xi laid out some of the key points in China's updated Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs. By 2035, China will cut economic-wide net greenhouse gas emissions by 7 to 10% from peak levels. Non-fossil fuels will make up more than 30% of total energy consumption. Wind and solar capacity will expand more than six-fold compared with 2020, reaching about 3,600 gigawatts. China also pledges to grow its forest stock to over 24 billion cubic meters, and the national carbon market will be expanded to cover major high-emission sectors with the goal of building a climate-adaptive society. So what should we make of these numbers, and what messages is China sending to the world with this new commitment? To help unpack this, I spoke with Lauri Myllyvirta, leading analyst at the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air based in Helsinki. Lauri has long been a close watcher of China's energy sector and climate policies. Hello, Lauri. Thank you for joining me today on Climate Watch. And it's been a big day in the climate circle, especially for those who are watching China's climate targets. So the Chinese President Xi Jinping announced the latest NDC targets, which is reducing emissions 7 to 10% by the year 2035. This is basically the headline target, but there are also more detailed ones that we'll discuss later in this episode. But first of all, let's set the tone here. What's your overall assessment of this target?
So, of course, this is the first time that China is setting an absolute emission target. The previous targets, including the one for year 2030, are emission intensity targets. And this is the first time that China is setting a target that covers all greenhouse gases and all sectors. So those are steps forward. The target is quite cautious, I would say, compared with what we at least projected China will be able to do, given the recent progress with clean energy. This is setting the floor for China's ambition, but certainly not the ceiling. So I think the remark by Xi Jinping that China will strive to do more is important in recognizing that the country could go further. And if we look at China's previous headline targets for 2030, they were initially announced in 2015, and then President Xi personally announced an upgrade in 2021. So it's also possible to adjust the targets if progress is faster than currently.
So I think it was earlier this year that the Chinese president, when he was sort of giving previews to the NDC targets, he mentioned that the new NDC will cover all greenhouse gas emissions in all economic sectors. And so I'm very curious about your take on which kind of greenhouse gas or which sector do you think would face the biggest challenge when China is trying to achieve this new targets of up to 10% of emission cut?
I think the challenges in different sectors and the opportunities are so different that it's hard to say that to compare them directly. Mm-hmm. So for especially the energy sector, you have the opportunity that there is this rapid progress with wind, solar, nuclear, electric vehicles, and so on, that have the potential of bringing down the emissions from the sector. But then the challenge will be starting to scale down, to phase down the coal industry, which is, of course, traditionally super important in China. But then for some other sectors, like let's say methane emissions from coal mines, there's a lot that you can do without affecting the operations of the industry, but it does require expenditure and investment. And then there are sectors where it's enforcement, like the super greenhouse gases, fluorinated gases, where a few offending facilities can completely throw off your target. So it requires very thorough enforcement, but the affected industries are quite small. And then agriculture, of course, is an incredibly important and complex sector in China and so on. So all of these sectors have their own challenges and opportunities. But just the fact that now for the first time there's a target that covers all of these different sectors, it can catalyze a lot of progress in starting to implement emission reductions.
So, in terms of, for example, in wind and solar, which definitely China has a lot of know-hows, has a lot of capacities to scale things up. What's your expectations when it comes to from now to 2035 when it comes to the further scaling up of these renewable energies? And what are some of the possible bottlenecks that China also could face along the way?
So right now, China's seen a boom in especially solar in the past few years, really astonishing amounts of capacity that have been added. And the key bottleneck that has emerged is the electric grid. So the power grid has started to struggle to integrate all of the solar and wind capacity that has been coming online, and doing that requires reforms to the way that the grid is managed and operated. It requires some investment in transmission and distribution lines, and going forward, it also requires investment in electricity storage, which is already starting to happen. So all of those are things that China knows how to do, but there's a lot to be done there. China's also introduced a new policy that changes how the developers of new wind and solar projects are paid. That is, changes the way that the industry operates. They used to have a guaranteed price that is based on the benchmark price of coal-fired power in each province, and then now it's more market-based. The project developers have to make contracts directly with buyers and compete for contracts where the volume of new projects settles under this new policy is a hugely important question. And of course, the targets for the next 5-year period are being set right now by the central government, but also by provincial governments, by state-owned enterprises, and so on. And those will play a huge role. But my general expectation is that the amount of wind and solar being added will stay at the levels that were achieved already in the past couple of years and even climb from there, which also means that the target that was announced for solar and wind capacity in 2035 will be substantially exceeded. A key reason for that is that the clean energy sectors have become so important for China economically. If the volume of the industry started to fall, that would then mean that those industries would be a drag on GDP growth. Growth in those industries would support China's economic goals as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned, I think China does has the capacity to scale the generation up. And the question is now to distribution and basically the use of those powers being generated. We've also talked on this podcast about a recent market-based sort of pricing system, but that's more of a central government's decision and roadmap. What really matters is down to the provincial and even city level governments on how they plan to do things. And now we are seeing some provinces are rolling out their roadmap and their rules when it comes to how to trade these solar and wind power on the market-based mechanism. So how do you think, for example, I think the latest one we saw, the province of Shandong recently has a set of rules about this. So how do you evaluate their rules, and how do you think the markets are trying to absorb this new type of energy into their system?
Shandong is a bit of a special case because it has a huge aluminum industry that has built its own coal-fired power plants. So Shandong's power market is even within China is quite special, and that affects the pricing and the space for solar, especially. The results from the auction in Shandong were quite encouraging for wind. The prices that wind power generators secured in the auction will be high enough to support projects going forward. For solar developers, what happened was that the winning bids basically came from projects that were already locked in or that were already even operating. And so they were putting in bids that are quite low. And one notable thing about China's auction system is that you can bid into the auction, and if you win, you're also allowed to exit. So the auction system is really the backstop for developers, and right now it looks like it's going to be more profitable for them to sell directly to the medium or long-term market, so directly to industrial users and so on, than to use the auctions and the spot market as their business model. But all of these changes simply mean that there's going to be a lot of exploration of different business models. How do you combine solar with storage to get higher revenue? The idea of virtual power plants, zero carbon industrial parks, captive power for industry, and so on. So it's really just going to be a lot of exploration and innovation. And I do think Shandong and many other provinces do want to see the solar boom continue. So
we will see a lot of innovations, basically experiments carrying out throughout the country, not only in terms of technologies, but also in terms of business models. And I think another very interesting, important innovation when it comes to our adaptation and mitigation methods is with the carbon market, really. And China has also been making some progress. This year, we see a major step forward when it comes to the national carbon market, which is called the National Carbon Emissions Trading Market in Xi Jinping's remarks. Right now, it's also a central government document. We need more follow-up rules and policies to see how these will carried out in practice. What do you think is the next possible sector that will be incorporated in the new design of China's national carbon market?
So currently, the situation is that the power sector is covered. Steel, cement, and aluminum are covered, but they are still in what is called phase one of compliance, which is more about getting the system up and running than really driving.
So it's not been traded on the market yet?
First compliance deadline is by the end of the year. So if there are companies that don't have enough emission allowances, they will need to trade. And of course, if there are companies that have more than they need, they can also trade. So trading is starting as well, but the emission allocation has still been quite generous. So it's really about getting emission reporting in place, getting the system in place, and starting in this soft way. But so beyond those sectors, the most obvious one to extend coverage to is the chemical sector. Since the pledge is to cover all high emitting sectors, there isn't one definite answer on which sectors do those include, but the chemical sector most definitely has to be included in order to say that all high emitting sectors are covered. And I think even more important than which other sectors are added is how the market develops in general. So, for example, the single biggest emission reduction opportunity in China besides the power sector is the steel sector, where there is the potential to make a major shift from using primary steel produced with coal from iron ore to recycled steel. And so changing the emission trading in a system in a way that creates an incentive for this shift would be a clear example of how the system could play a role in China's overall emission reduction efforts, making the system actually drive these kinds of shifts in production methods.
So the reason that you think steel is the most promising sector to be further decarbonized is only about production? Is there other, factors that are also at play here?
It's the combination of two factors. So China's steel production has plateaued for the past few years. because of the end of the construction boom that China saw in the preceding couple of decades. And it's normal that after such a boom, demand for steel starts to be saturated. And so when you have plateauing or declining steel demand, and at the same time you have more buildings, more vehicles, more machinery, and so on coming to the end of their life, you have much more scrap steel, waste steel available for recycling. And that really creates the opportunity. And if you simply do the numbers for the next a decade, steel is the second largest emitting sector in China after electricity. And if you combine a slow decline in the output volume with this opportunity of drastically increasing the amount of recycled steel production, then that amounts to a big opportunity to reduce the use of coal in steel making.
I'm really curious about where you stand on the use of, because right now that we are seeing this differentiated stance when it comes to how to use coal. Some are calling for absolute phasing out of coal in any energy system. Others are seeing it more still at play and also play a role even in a future green energy system. So I'm curious about what your take on this, and how do you evaluate or assess the current coal development in China?
I think if you look at the actual scenarios and energy models proposed by different institutes and so on, I think the disagreement is much smaller than it is in terms of the rhetoric. And especially it's a little disagreement over what needs to happen over the next decades. When you try to project what will the eventual clean energy system for China look like in 2050 or 2060, then some people say that maybe you will still have 10% or 20% of energy coming from fossil fuels using carbon capture and storage. Some people say that they don't think that actually makes sense economically or technically, and it's actually better to have 100% or 95% non-fossil energy. But that's still in terms of what needs to happen now, starting to phase down coal, both in the power sector and outside, electrifying as much of energy use as possible, replacing direct use of fossil fuels with electricity. Those things are very clear, and there is basically full agreement between different institutes and researchers that those things need to start happening. And that was reflected in what Xi Jinping said, pledged back in 2021, that in the next 5 years, China will start to gradually phase down the use of coal. It's really about what's the pace, when does the scaling down start, and how do you manage, especially coal-fired power? Do you keep quite a lot of coal-fired power capacity online for the next decade and reduce its utilization, or do you start to already at least restrict new projects and close down existing capacity? And so the way that I look the developments in China over the past few years is that there were these electricity shortages in China back in 2020, 2021, 22, and that was a real shock to both local and central government policymakers. And it led to several different responses. It accelerated the efforts to reform the electricity market. It led to a lot of investment in electricity storage, and it led a wave of investment in new coal and gas-fired power plants, and all of the above approach. Now those electricity shortages haven't been happening to anywhere near the same degree in the past couple of summers. A lot of that is because grid operation was improved. And so now it's a different situation. But I think the response just reflects the mentality in China that it's better to deploy several different solutions and make absolutely sure that you solve the problem than try to do the absolute minimum. But now I think China is in a position where the need for a new coal-fired power plants can be reevaluated because so much storage is coming online, and progress has been made with making the power grid more flexible and more adaptable.
Do you see China has already started to cutting back on the use of coal already?
Coal consumption has been falling for the past 1.5 years. So in that sense, there is a trend of coal consumption falling, but there are clearly diverging views among policymakers on whether this is the peak or whether you want to still leave space for a period where coal consumption would increase before it peaks before 2030. And the fact that the emission target that China announced refers to a peak level and not a specific year of emissions reflects that uncertainty or still leaving the question open. But simply arithmetically, if the growth of clean energy continues at the rate that was achieved in the past few years, that would mean that coal consumption would continue to fall also in the next years, and we would already be past the peak.
That's very interesting because here in China, within a lot of businesses, investors are also waiting and looking at these NDC targets, also for the purpose of watching the market, getting the next development on the market when it comes to clean energy or any sectors that's related. Well, basically all sectors are related to climate targets these days. So it's also vital for them to look at these NDC targets. What do you expect could have the biggest chance or the fastest growth over the next few years up to 2035?
I think for solar, wind, EVs, those were technologies that were basically singled out specifically. So it's more of an affirmation that they are the key drivers of China's energy transition. I'm not an expert on forest issues, but the target for forest cover seems to be the biggest step up. So there's certainly a lot to do on that side.
We've talked a lot about NDCs, and that's basically been headlining in a lot of media outlets. But another thing that he's emphasized in his remarks is about, building up confidence, living up to responsibilities and international cooperation. And what kind of message do you think, and his remarks is made at the UN Climate Summit to countries around the world, what kind of message do you think China is trying to send to these countries at a UN meeting?
I think that needs to be heard in the context, of course, of the US attacking the entire global climate effort and attacking green energy in an incredibly misguided way. So it's a very good recognition that it's important to maintain and build confidence, build coalitions of countries that want to move forward. And certainly in the context of China signals that the country wants to work with the global south to support other countries in their clean energy transition. China's already, of course, doing that, especially China's solar and EV exports are really moving the needle, really leading other global south countries to start decarbonizing at a pretty early stage in their economic development. And there's a lot of potential for China to work with countries in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America on that front.
Well, there has been sort of a contrast, I think, this time at the UN when it comes to what's been said by the US and what's been said by China. And that got me thinking, when it comes to mitigating and adapting to climate change, you can't really count on one or two countries. It's really about global efforts. We are seeing actually this gap between those of the global south and also those of the global north. Do you think there are ways to close or narrow this gap, especially in current stage?
I think it's inevitable that different countries are pulling in different directions and at different paces. But the clean energy transition at the moment is incredibly broad-based. So when I've been looking at, for example, China's exports of solar, EVs, batteries, and so on, the most striking thing is not any single country, but it's the very long list of countries that are are starting to deploy that technology at scale. So I think that economic trend of the competitiveness of clean energy will just pull along a lot of countries where the politics is not there yet, simply because right now, for most countries, it makes more sense if you want affordable electricity, if you want reliable electricity, it makes more sense to install solar with storage than it makes sense to build a new gas plant, for example, let alone a coal plant. So I think that's the opportunity, and also both within the global north and the global south, there is a pretty long list of countries that is willing to move forward, that has targets for reaching net zero emissions, that has targets for the energy transition. So getting rid of the mentality that the US sets the tone for the whole world is really important, and building those networks and coalitions of countries that want to move forward is key. And I think the remarks by President Xi reflect that he didn't say that China's going to lead this, China's going, let alone do this alone, but that China wants to work with others to find solutions and build confidence, which is certainly positive.
So you're not really concerned when it comes to whether the US or any other politicians and going out there and saying, this is a lie or it doesn't work. The trend is the trend.
It's of course hugely damaging to have the world's biggest industrialized country say this. It's having an impact on companies, for example, that are cutting back their green policies and so on because they're afraid of backlash in the US and so on. So none of this is helpful. But I do think that the critical mass is there even without the US, and the key opportunity is that for the first time the aims of economic development, energy security, climate protection are aligned, because the technology to accomplish all of those things at the same time is there for the first time, really.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Lauri, for coming on to the show and talk with us.
Thanks so much, Fei. Great talking to you.
A big thank you to Lauri Myllyvirta for sharing his insights, and thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, or share it with a friend. And if you have any questions about our planet or ideas for future episodes, you can always reach me at fei.fei@cgtn.com or find me on my Substack newsletter, Rivers and Mountains. Until next time.